We're here at Camp Alphaville after the China panel up Shybor Creek, and I'm here with Michael Pettis, Professor of Finance at Peking University. Michael, we just heard you talk for a fair bit about the path of Chinese growth and the different stages that involves. So I wonder if you could take us through that a bit again.
Yes, I think about the last 4 decades in China as consisting sort of 4 different stages of growth. Broadly speaking, in the 1980s, China imposed a series of liberalizing reforms. In the 1990s, we saw a very different growth model in which China took steps to force up the savings rate by constraining the growth in consumption and then allocating those savings to investments that were necessary, investments in the manufacturing sector and in infrastructure. At some point, perhaps in the late 90s, early part of the last decade, it became increasingly difficult to identify productive investments. And at that point, China should have switched its growth model towards something that was much more towards a more efficient allocation of capital. It's very difficult to switch from that growth model, and historically no country has ever done so.
And what makes that so difficult?
Probably in large part because we have a model in which resources are centralized and allocated, and that process creates a very powerful elite that continues to support that model. And so to switch away from that model tends to generate tremendous political resistance. And really that's where we are now in China. We need to return, in a sense, to the 1980s to a series of liberalizing reforms. But that means, of course, undermining the existing elite. And in China, there's a phrase for that. We call it the vested interests, and that refers to those groups that are opposed to any change in the current growth model. And yet that's what President Xi has to do. And those were the reforms that were proposed during the third plenum.
And so what do you see Xi doing to become a new Deng? I mean, he's going to need to consolidate power in quite an aggressive manner.
Yes, and he seems to be doing that. I think for the last 3 to 4 years, it's very clear that institutionally, President Xi has more power than we've seen any of his predecessors since Deng Xiaoping. And I think that's a necessary part of the implementation of those reforms. Otherwise, I think it's going to be too difficult to do.
And to finish this up, what are those reforms? I mean, your thesis is rebalancing towards the household sector. Maybe take us through how that goes and kind of what China's growth rate is going to look like over in the medium term.
Well, basically during the last 30 to 40 years, you had very rapid growth, but the household share of that growth contracted very sharply. Rebalancing means the opposite. It means that the household share of growth has to expand, even as growth rates slow significantly. So that's just a complicated way of saying one way or the other, rebalancing in China means a transfer of wealth from the state sector to the household sector. And if you look at nearly all of the reforms proposed during the third plenum, whether it's hukou reform, land reform, financial sector reform, etc., they all do the same thing. They transfer wealth from the state sector to the household sector, which is why politically it's so difficult to do.
And to put a figure on that, a GDP?
It's really hard to say, but my guess is that an orderly transition will probably see something like anywhere from 2 to 3% of GDP transferred every year.
Okay, thanks, Michael. That's all from us at Camp Alphaville. If you want to see more, go to ft.com/Alphaville. Thank you very much.